Welcome to the latest podcast, Digital Disability, looking at disability films, on film, etc., with Dr. Alison Wilde, Dr. Mira Griffiths, and myself, Paul Dark. So this week we're looking at this time we're looking at Rising Phoenix, the Netflix documentary about Paralympics, and Code of Freaks, a film about disability in cinema. So let's start with Rising Phoenix. What do you think, Miro?
It wasn't that enjoyable to watch. And I've got a problem with the Paralympics in that I find there's this perpetual fascination with impairment effects and the history and the narrative of the individual acquiring their impairment or triumphing over their impairment, and navigating the life course. And I think that was transferred into the documentary. I don't know who made the documentary. I was interested when I was watching it who were the actual documentary makers, and whether they'd have done anything on disability beforehand. But it was for me anyway. It was throwing out those old tropes of disabled people experiencing tragedy, being denied opportunities in their life, so they need to kind of succeed. There's so many metaphors of overcoming your impairment and doing well in sport, and of course this constant move to emphasize the Paralympic legacy, and of course what legacy, and when there's been a continuation of austerity, of a hostile environment for disabled people. That's not even addressed at all in documentary. And you can say, of course, well, it's focusing on sport, but of course they made so many references to how disabled people's lives were improved, or the attitudes towards disabled people were improved because of the Paralympics. And I just thought it was so crass not to actually acknowledge the real political environments affecting disabled people and the disabled people's community. So I did not enjoy watching it, and actually talking about it now, it's made me a little bit angry.
Well, I'll just say I agree, and then I'll ask Alison, and then we'll talk about it a bit more. What do you think, Alison?
I'm going to start with possibly the most positive thing. I really enjoyed the music that played it out. I think that was something to do with Hip Hop Nation, but that was quite. I wanted to hear more of that actually. It was just, and it was. I did actually look it up. I didn't look at the question that you had, Miro, but that was made specially for it. But that was. I really enjoyed that. That was the most pleasant part. I'm not a sports fan, so in some ways it was kind of, if I'm being objective about it, it was never going to really like too many things for me. But having said that, I am quite interested in debates around the Paralympics. So yeah, it felt a bit torn. I think to not repeat what you've said, all of which I agree with, Miro, I think it was quite a badly made documentary. I found it really bitty. I was just beginning to get into the story of, say, one athlete, and then we're suddenly in history, and those very close face-ups with the daughter of, what's his name, Gutman, Gutman's daughter. It's like, why, why are we looking right into her face? These kind of technical aspects. And then you were just getting into the history of it, and then all of a sudden we're back on, and it kept jumping like that. And I thought, why are they doing that? There was no kind of, it was quite disorientating. So that was one of my issues with it. But I think another thing that, again, I'm trying to add to what you said rather than repeat it. Another thing for me that it kind of got me thinking about again is generally that place of well, all people, but disabled people in particular, in terms of awards and the kind of discourses of winning that were running through it, which kind of accounted to some of the things are saying about worth and value, and it's like, you know, I always feel quite uneasy about the fact that most of us go along quite uncritically with being the best actor, the best sportsman, the best academic, all this type of thing. And I remember Debbie Jolly once actually criticising this in public, and I was really glad to see it. Is that, like that surely is part of the problem. So once I was thinking about that, I found it quite hard to focus on the programme, because I find that whole issue of disabled people and meritocracy and awards kind of quite fascinating. So yeah, there were a couple of characters I thought were quite endearing that I was drawn into. The fencer, I really enjoyed watching the young fencer. Just that was pure curiosity. I found it actually very pleasing to watch them doing that. So I almost would have preferred to watch a whole hour of two people fencing, I think.
I thought it was dreadful. It was quite funny because I was watching it with a young person. He said, "Well, you're being totally unfair." I said, "You're sitting there, and I can feel you emanating antipathy and hatred towards this." And he said, "And you're being unfair because that's the point of sport. Just because it's disability, it's no different. That's the Olympics. And if it had been about the main Olympics or a sports championship, that's what they're all like. This isn't specifically bad against you." And I got what he meant, but it didn't make it any better. And of course, that was the key thing. It was quite interesting because I went to all of the Paralympics because I was lucky I had press accreditation and I did an Arts Council project there, etc., on photography, etc. So I went to a lot of it. And again, so a lot of it was not true. This idea that it was packed at all time. It wasn't. The big stadium was a lot, but that's because people couldn't get tickets to the main one and wanted to go. It was much cheaper. Most of the other events were quite, mediocrely attended. Some of them quite bad. I quite like sport. I think Miro likes sport. I tend to quite like sport. So I did quite enjoy some of the sport. Some of it just made me laugh, but that's me being cruel. But again, that's true of all sport. So, for example, I went to the equestrianism in Greenwich Park, I think, and I have never seen such a pointless thing in my life. But that's got nothing to do with it being disabled people doing equestrianism. Anybody doing equestrianism is, life is too short for humanity to be doing this kind of drivel. But I think that whole narrative, I personally believe, like you're talking about the meritocracy and all of that, and I think Miro said something to me, you said something about it earlier, is I think disabled people are in a lot worse position now. The mass of disabled people are in a lot worse position since the Paralympics due to the Paralympics. It legitimated this whole idea of the deserving and the undeserving, the pathologizing or personalizing the biomedical model, all of that kind of crap that actually, if you try a bit harder, you can be as normal and as able as anybody else. When I was a kid, I was always threatened with Douglas Bader. He'd lost his legs in the war, and it was kind of like, well, he could do it with no legs. Why can't you do it? So you can learn to walk, to the extent that my father wanted to considered having my legs cut off so that I could have false legs to walk. And, which was just, in retrospect, was fucking insane. And so that whole legacy of these kind of people. But I don't have a problem with the Paralympics per se, in the sense of anybody wanting to be the best they can physically, in any way whatsoever. I don't have a problem with that. But the whole point is that doesn't exist in a vacuum outside of the politics of the oppression of disabled people through what the Paralympics represents. And This didn't challenge that, which I thought was a missed opportunity. And it merely reinforced it, partly through individualizing it, triumph over tragedy, all of those old tropes that were just pretty much endless. And again, that didn't mean you didn't get involved with them. You know, I thought the youth of the fencer was incredibly charming and engaging. But again, that was nothing to do with her being disabled. That's the engagement of youth and passion and that kind of thing. But I think it kind of the kind of failure to recognize its contribution to the furtherance of the oppression of disabled people through the fantasies of meritocracy and the indulgence of normalization through sport that oppresses those who either don't wish to or can't or don't want to indulge in that, was a true dereliction of duty in the producers and the makers of it. I had some technical problems with it as well. These glossy, beautifully photographed individual interviews that peppered it about the key people, but not all of them, that were highly stylized, tended to get on my nerves after a while, especially if you're then mixing with very low quality film and whatever. And it didn't do it in a particular way. I think if you look up what the directors had previously made, they'd made the fashion film about Steve McQueen, the designer, and that whole look of kind of the stylized look in, like, I think The Fencer it was in a kind of semi-derelict country house kind of look, which was a throwback to that kind of fashion shoots that they'd obviously done. It just ended up grating with me enormously.
Yeah, I agree. I think one that struck me in particular actually was, I've forgotten his last name, but that John Baptiste guy who gave the most, obviously had the most awful past that he'd come from, which was quite interesting in a really horrible, dark way. And then we suddenly see him in perhaps the most opulent mise-en-scène of the whole documentary. Yeah. And I just completely jarred with me. I couldn't listen to him when he's there sitting in this vast room on this velvet sofa. So yeah, I think that was particularly bad.
Along with the cheetah, the African animal, and yeah, and it was just like, oh God, do this better, juxtapose it.
I say, no wonder he's running. He's got a cheetah right behind his heels. Yeah, that was just, oh, please.
Miro, let's come back to you.
No, I'm just saying, because you know, on the one level, you can understand, because sport is inherently elitist and it's about trying to dominate and achieve over your competitors. But I think that my main problem with the Paralympics is that it then tries to use that framing or that narrative to then explain disabled people in broader society and in wider society beyond sport. And that's where I have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with the issue of sport in general and the issue of disabled people participating in sport. If you want to compete, then that's fine, whatever you want to do. But when you start then trying to use that in order to make sense of disabled people's position in society, that's where I get a problem. And I watch the Paralympics, and it's astounding how many times, even as the athletes are preparing to race or whatever they're doing, you will literally get, the camera will look at athlete number one, and you get a backstory about that. What's their impairment? Explain the impairment effects. What's the history of how they acquired their impairment? Athlete two, what's their impairment? And it's just like you never get this, and it's just it's almost in this kind of purest form, this idea of the kind of voyeurism of impairment, the idea of the curiosity of the impairment rather than of the competitor trying to what's the skill level of the competitor compared to to those around them. And that's why it's so unsettling, these kind of documentaries, because it reinforces that message of breaking down barriers to achieve whatever you want to achieve, live life to the fullest and so on. And, I mean, I think I might have said to you, Paul, after I watched it when you sent me the link, it almost felt like you could see this being on a loop in a DWP benefit center, or or in an Atos building. That kind of, because it's the biopsychosocial model of, you got impairments and there's barriers that you experience, but you know what? If you think positively and you try and be elitist and competitive, you'll get through this, and then you'll get to sit on these velvety sofas, with a cheetah by your side. And I completely agree with Alison. The guy. John Baptiste, and he's talking about his story, and then he starts to talk about his experience of hate crime and disability hate crime as well
in France.
And it's like, in France, and it's like 1 minute, and then just move, and then it's gone back to him. It's gone back to him sitting on his velvety sofa, talking about how he was, in the Olympic Center, so in the Olympic Village. So there's this real, I have just real problems with it. And also, I think one thing I was really interested in was when they were doing the history of it, and they're talking, and they go back to the kind of Gutman era, and I don't know who it is. It might even be Prince Harry who says it. He says the idea was to try to get disabled people to be taxpayers, and try and get them to be citizens and be productive to society. And the answer to being productive in society is to be competitive and to be to be worthwhile.
That's a point I wanted to bring up as well. Completely agree with you. And why Prince Harry? Really, why?
The Invictus Games. He's been inspired to set up the Invictus Games for disabled soldiers. It's just, But I think that what you're saying about the guy on the sofa, how they brought up the politics of tribal hatred that had led him to there, purely to exploit it. There was no sense of bringing politics into a broader sense. It was a purely exploitative use of the politics that it engaged with.
Absolutely.
And trying to it was just absolutely atrocious.
It was interesting, wasn't it? Because there was so many of the, in fact, I can't even think of any. All of the athletes who were interviewed, I think, talked about how they really struggled with this acceptance of their identity as a disabled person. They were desperate not to associate with disabled people, and it's almost like they got to get that in, and then they talk about how sport was the catalyst for accepting it, but accepting it in a way which is about not really identifying with the politics of disabled people or being a politicized disabled person. So it not only does it kind of advance our understanding of disability, in the politics of disability or politics of disablement, it almost reverses what we've been doing for years, because it's that idea of, that we acknowledge that there is this problem of identification, but the way to solve it is through this kind of elitist narrative of triumph over diversity. And I think for non-disabled audiences, or for people who are new to the world of identifying as a disabled person, this is really problematic, I think. Documentary.
But what I would say is, and I think, and again, it's part of an agenda that's incredibly dangerous. And again, because we both come from kind of activists, political awareness, political engagement. This was almost trying to claim, and the people who run it, as the Paralympics as the political movement of disability, and that is a really dangerous, awful thing to be doing, and it was I would say it was actively doing that, or the people in it were actively doing that, kind of like what they were claiming, which of course is completely untrue. Kind of like all progress in disabled people's lives is down to the Paralympics. And in fact, it as we've tried to explain, it tends to be a retrograde step at every moment, and it was funny because they didn't even go for the interesting moments, like, for example, George Osborne was booed at the Paralympics in London, as were a number of other politicians, all from the Conservatives, but it didn't stop them continuing doing what they were doing. So it had no effect on them. And equally, then you had the little moment of Oscar Pistorius in it as well, kind of like,
yeah.
You know, let's pretend that didn't exist. And of course I find Oscar Pistorius just absolutely fascinating in that link into Paralympics and male sport linked with masculinity and all of those kind of things that, you know, I think are probably key points of what led him to what he did. But as the young person I was watching it with said, when he was telling me I was being completely unfair, and he said, you shouldn't see it as being about disabled people, because if you watch any sport, they're all fucked up. They're going to stay fucked up, and it is just a fucked up business. And that was it, really. So to some extent, we are being harsh because that's what elite sport is. It's just fucked up.
Fair point. Fair point. Well, that's what an elite anything is, really.
Yeah.
So.
You know, it's usually rooted in some kind of seriously warped problem. Anyway, so I think, and I've always said, you know, even when 20 years ago, I always said, to me, any film, we'll probably get into that in the next one as well. If normal people like it, normal in quotes, obviously, there's usually something seriously wrong with it.
Well, that's good. You haven't read out the comment. You know when you usually read out the comments of IMDb what they say about it. You should have read it out.
You've read them, have you? They all love it, do they?
But I was waiting for you to read them out. Well,
I think it's safer not to nowadays.
Well, it's interesting, and I think was Philip Craven at one point says in the documentary, this is a movement for good. And it's like, and how do you substantiate that, Philip? And of course, what the one thing I did enjoy about it, and again, it was glossed over. It kind of referenced it, but it was more involved in the self-indulgence of how the three of them sorted out the problems in Rio with the funding. But of course, that's a really fascinating area to investigate, isn't it? The politics of accessibility, the representation of disabled people, the reluctance to take the disabled people seriously in a competition, and the idea that it was all just kind of framed as, well, you got a bit of a corrupt establishment who spent the money, and we spent all our time trying to get some additional money through a kind of to try and solve the issue. And of course, that alongside these claims in the documentary that disabled people's position in China has improved drastically since then. In London, it's improved. Rio, there's now more representation. And all the way I'm sitting there thinking, I'd love you to try and put some quotes up from the shadow reports of the UN, and when the committee investigates human rights violations against disabled people in all these different countries. There's a real disparity in what this documentary was trying to portray. And I know, it's not surprising, but I was just really aggrieved. But it was nice to compare that to the next documentary that we watched.
Well, it's always good to leave a comment with the comment, I was aggrieved by watching this film. Right, I think we've said enough about that one. So moving on to Code of Freaks. Miro started the last, so Alison, let's start with you. Code of Freaks.
I was really disappointed.
Mm.
I was really looking forward to it. Sorry, very scattered thoughts on this.
Spill them.
There were some people who said some of the talking heads on it were very good. Obviously, I think for me anyway, Lawrence Carter Long and Matt, of course. I forget everybody's names actually. I've forgotten her name now. I can't. But there was one very humorous woman on there.
Techie.
Yes. I really liked her. I think she made some really good points. However, by and large, I wondered. I think it would be a really, really, really good introduction for somebody who knows nothing about that area. I think some of it was misrepresented. I think some of it actually was oversimplified. So those bits kind of I found quite irritating, and I imagine you probably would, given the depth of your knowledge in this area. So I kept trying to think this is probably for an audience which is not us, but certainly for us, I didn't learn anything new. And again, I think it would have benefited from a narrator all the way through, rather than the talking heads thing. One particular point where I got quite annoyed actually was right at the end, when they suddenly started with percussion over what the last, I think, 3 people were saying, and I had to replay that over and over again because I'm not good at hearing people's voices above. I think that was really a really inaccessible thing to do. So yeah, by and large, I found it disappointing, and there was a huge omission for me in it. It's kind of seemed a bit imbalanced in the kind of. It deliberately went to some issues, like for example, the intersectional Black and disabled issues, or race and disabled issues. And given that, sorry to put myself here, but given the work I've done on this, just a little bit, I found it extraordinary that they could talk about that and use a few specific films and not mention non-white women at all. It's like it was all about black masculinity, and I think it was quite a partial account. I did agree with a lot of the analysis of those films, but I think they repeated that over and over again. Another example, for example, was when they were talking about blind women. And again, as you know, Norden, for example, has done great work on that. There's quite a lot of work on that, and it didn't even begin to broach some of those issues about sexuality and blind women for me. So all in all, to sum up for now, I think it's a really good introduction if you know absolutely nothing, but I think it could have been executed far better.
I'll go with what I thought. I think I agree with you completely. I think it was for people who didn't know anything, and that's fine. That's fine. That's not a problem. I think, but I do agree that I think it missed massive opportunities. I think it missed an opportunity to break down scenes, for example, to be a lot clearer and specific. I presume there were some copyright issues on how long you can show a clip for. I think, for example, like I quite like the parallel of the Gattaca ending with the Elephant Man ending and the sky, and I thought that was a really nice piece, and I would have liked more of that.
Yeah.
A breakdown of a few key things that you could a bit more in depth of. I thought I hated the fact that they said that there's no good representations or no interesting representations, because I think there are, and I think there's quite a lot of them. But I think the biggest problem for me, it was trapped in the idea of that negative positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
It couldn't get to playing with that. For example, many disabled people I know, and myself included, we get a great deal out of the most awful representations of disability, because you can sit back and think, I'm right, society does see me in that way. And actually, you can get quite a significant degree of validation from watching a representation that is fundamentally awful, but actually reveals something about the nature of society that you can think, fuck, I'm right, they do hate me.
Just Gattaca.
Yeah. And I think it didn't have that. It got caught in wanting to be negative, actually, which is quite a bizarre thing to say, because and I think there were people who said some really interesting things. I think Carrie Sandel, however you say her name, said some really good stuff. Again, I like Lawrence Carter Long. I thought it was quite interesting. They sort of said, because I do veer towards this idea that if disabled people make it, it'll be better and it'll be different. And then they talk about a film that was written and directed by a disabled person, and it isn't, because often it's caught within the own strictures of the industry, etc. So, and I thought I would have quite a bit more to break down, because it was quite a short documentary. So I think there was space to go with it. So, and there were some interesting things on intersectionality and all that kind of stuff, and race and gender. But again, it didn't bring it all together to talk about how those tropes, cliches, archetypes, stereotypes all play to reinforce one another. They were all still separate. And I thought that that was a great missed opportunity to kind of broaden the kind of scope of analysis to talk about how we fit in within that whole kind of cultural section of oppression, to call it a better phrase.
Yeah, I agree.
And I did get a bit pissed off with the constant green screen. I.e., they were all green screen with a film behind them, which I thought distracted from it quite a lot.
It did actually. You're right.
You know, I do quite like green screen, but again, I think it would have been nicer to have someone engage in a scene in green screen and walk you through it. Actually, that would have been really nice, and I think that was a missed opportunity. I think, I'm making it sound awful. It was quite good in the sense that you kept thinking, yeah, I've seen that one. And I like films where you go, yeah, I've seen that one. I think there's a film called Final Cut, which I think Miro may have or whatever, which is basically, and it was a bit like the film at the Tate a few years ago. That was, it was the whole point of that film is it's the day in the life of humanity, and it goes through the day through clips from films that tend to be about 10 to 20 seconds long. I think the thing at the Tate was a 24-hour loop of film clips that were at the time of day that it happened. And you think, and the joy of that is going, yeah, I've seen that one. I've seen that one. Oh, I haven't seen that one. I'll have to get that one and watch that one.
Yeah.
Basket Case 1, Basket Case 2, Basket Case 3, and actually the key problem for me, apart from the, I think it was Teki Lemnicki, who was quite humorous, but in a deadpan kind of way, there was no fun. The humor of it. Some representations of disability are so awful. They're funny. You can just sit back and laugh and enjoy them. And you thought, you can do that, just give us a little bit of joy in this. So it was quite an interesting watch.
I kind of just interrupted me. I think Matt introduced a bit of fun. I disagreed with that point, but I found it funny, the one about him against a blind assailant. I disagree with the point he was making, because I think the Marvel Universe is something within itself, and even though obviously I agree with him when it was funny, I found those moments actually really helped the documentary along.
Yeah, I think as a 101 for filmmakers in film schools, it would be, try and avoid cliches, kind of educational tool. And I think it did that quite well, and it was okay, and it wasn't too long, length of a lecture. Miro, what are your golden words on this?
No, I'm pretty much in agreement. I wasn't. It was okay. It wasn't necessarily. I think as you said, the depth of the analysis wasn't there, was it? The critique wasn't there. So as an introduction to these issues, to be played out to a kind of an entry level into an undergraduate in disability studies or media, film, so on, it worked okay. There's some good, there's some interesting bits that they said, but I wanted them to then build on that. So when at one point they talk about the idea of I think very early on they talk about how inspirational stories sell, and that there's a domination to have these kind of stories because they work within the Hollywood formula. I wanted them to kind of explore that further and think creatively about, well, how do we resist that? How do we challenge that? Because at the beginning they make that assessment. Well, we're competing with a media industry that wants to have these types of messages because that's how the formula is set, and that's how you can succeed in getting the funding and so on to make those kind of films. And then at the end, you've got Matt Fraser, quite rightly, highlighting how non-disabled actors playing disabled characters, then having that reinforced because they typically win then the Oscars or the Golden Globes. And Matt's rallying call around Hollywood stop being disconnected from reality, stop trying to serve this horrible agenda. It left me with thinking, so what? What do we do then? Well, and
exactly.
Of course, my background's not in kind of disability film, I am aware of the depth of critique and analysis that goes on within it. And I thought, well, why can't we have that as part of the documentary as well? Because you've got the introduction to it, but those kind of tropes and those kind of stereotypes, they've been written about for years. And there's a lot of interesting, innovative work about how this impacts on the way that we understand certain people's position in society. And of course, what fascinates me as well as somebody who's not completely immersed within disability film, it's how these representations reinforce and or legitimize the discriminatory practices that go on in everyday life, in everyday society. And that's completely missed. It almost feels like it contains this discussion of film within film, and it didn't link then to the broader issues that are at play. The desire for inspirational stories, the horror, as Matt said, the horrible agendas, the disconnect, and that's what I'd like to see more of. But as you said, Paul, it also, I always do that. I go to the thing. I'm writing down all the films as I'm watching it, the ones I need to look at. Basket Case, which I've never seen, is absolutely fascinating if you watch it for 20 seconds in this documentary. I have literally no idea what's going on in that film, and it's equally horrifying as it is intriguing. So that's my weekend film, Basket Case.
Now it's funny because I thought it had, so for example, and they said things that really did quite annoy me. Apart from the word people with disabilities, which I hate as a phrase, because, to me, there's no such thing as people with disabilities. Disability is something that happens to people external to their own bodies, but that's just an American phrase. So, that's life. But actually, I think that time, that would have been a nice thing because it was actually about impairment, and again, that's fair enough, but let's stick to impairment. So it was kind of fairly depoliticized, but tried to be political. So, but equally, as someone said at one point, this is the only engagement most people will ever have with a disabled person. And I thought, no, that ain't true. There's so many disabled people. Everybody knows disabled people in their families and whatever. What to me is interesting is how popular culture can override personal knowledge, i.e. cognitive dissonance. That actually they can see a film about someone that they then apply to this person that they know, that they've known all their fucking life, and go, why can't you be like that? But you've known them your whole life. Why is this
Yeah.
Why is that suddenly so significant and important? And I thought that was a bit of a missed opportunity. So just as saying things like that, I thought, no, that ain't true.
It's kind of a reification, isn't it? It's not the people that it's this other thing.
Yeah, and so, but again, there were far too many, but it ties in with that whole thing about there was a lack of fun, that actually representations of disabled people can be so gloriously awful that they're fantastic, that can tie in with this other good representation. To me, the best disability film of all time was Young Frankenstein. That's full of disability. Why wasn't that in there? And I thought because it didn't go along with their narrative, and that showed that it had its weaknesses because they tried to ignore things that actually might have challenged that.
Could I add to your? Oh, sorry. Could I add to your? You go if you want, Miro.
No, you, Alison. You're first.
Could I add to your thing about the positive and negative thing? I think in some bits of it, maybe this was down to the producers, I think it got really quite lazy. I mean, apart from the fact that what you were just saying and the positive negative thing makes you think that all those people think exactly the same thing, which I'm sure there is. There are different interpretations within there of those films. One thing that I've got a bit of a bugbear about this film anyway, those kind of quick pictures of stills of film or just little segments at the end included a film they didn't talk about, which is Shape of Water. And me, Alison Sheldon and Joe Crawshaw have written in defence of that film, for example. And I think they didn't say why they were putting it up as a bad representation, but I'm assuming it's because the impairment she has in the film isn't the impairment that she has in real life and everything. But it was not talked about, and it was assumed that this was a wrong film. Yeah. And I really don't think that did it any favours at all. This idea that we all think the same thing. Anybody who criticises disability portrayals in film or any other media all think the same thing, which we certainly don't.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know,
A final thing, because I'm aware that Mira wants to speak, is it really made me think back to when we talked about Junie Moon.
mm-hmm.
And there was the thing that came up from one woman about wanting to see more than one disabled person together. And I've said it myself in writing I've done is like, you know, as Norden said, disabled people are usually by themselves. They are usually isolated. And the one thing about that Junie Moon was able to do was to get a really good relational view, despite its flaws. And of course, going back to the premise of the film, Freaks, we only get that collective sense because we're seeing real disabled people interact. You could even get that arguably with non-disabled people playing those roles as well. So it's like that was kind of glossed over, which is a shame, because one thing that did come out really clearly in the film was that feeling I imagine most of us who've been lucky enough have, is that feeling of when you're with your disabled community, and actually that feeling of value, which I certainly felt when I was first introduced to the disability arts movement in particular. And I really felt it was a shame that wasn't pursued more, because it was definitely in there at the beginning and the end. But that issue of having more than one person in disabled person in the film, I think, is really important.
But again, linked to that, actually, this idea that if it was about two disabled people who end up together, there was this idea that would be better intrinsically, which isn't true. You know, and it's just it's about what it is, and just, you know, and I understand you've picked your route and you're going to go with it, and you know, and that 101 kind of stuff, and you know, but there were so many. It's not for us. You know, and I think that was quite. I would recommend it to people, because I think, you know, particularly non-disabled people who don't particularly know anything, because I think they'll enjoy it and think, well, I remember that film.
I will too.
You know, and there's often this thing, you know, there aren't many disabled people in film. Well, again, watch this. There's lots. They're all over the place. Miro, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to ask you both for your view of. I think it goes back to our point before around the kind of the kind of the comedy of some of the representations of people in film, and again, I think there's at one point there's one of the people being interviewed talks about the Farrelly brothers films and says, actually, I quite like them, and then talks about the kind of, you know, does comedy around disability dehumanize or does it humanize? And I just wondered, you know, as two esteemed scholars in film and disability, I wondered what was your view of kind of not just Farrelly brothers films, but in general, but in fact, when film approaches disability through the lens of comedy.
Well, I'll leave that to Alison, and she's written the book.
I didn't quite hear all of that for some reason, but one of my chapters in my book, again, I'm on that, in my last book, not my next book, it is on the Farrelly brothers, and I just think I agreed with that. Was one of the more interesting parts of that, actually. I agree that this is just an absolutely excellent way to get into understanding what's at stake in everybody's interactions with disabled people on screen. I think comedy can be very oppressive too, you know, same old stuff on comedy theory, but it can be the most significant, I think, and I think the Farrelly brothers were exceptional at that, although, as you'll read, if you read my book, I think that the fact that they were so good at that actually worried the industry. And I've heard other disabled, this isn't entirely my idea, I've heard other disabled people say the same, is that I think the industry were getting frightened at the increasing politicisation within that comedy. So there's a real issue there of how far you can go with actually satire on disableism, as it were. I'm sorry if that didn't answer your question.
No, I think it did, didn't it, Miro?
No, absolutely. Because for me, you know, it resonates when I can't remember the person's name in the film, but when he talks about, you know, the Farrelly brothers, and I you know, tend to enjoy the Farrelly brothers, because what it does is it reminds me of the comedic events that happen when I do engage with, particularly with non-disabled people. And because there's that kind of awkwardness, there's that kind of, there's something humorous about the interaction of somebody entering the world of disability, but not being clear and not being able to understand it and not knowing the kind of principles and the politics behind it. And then, of course, as a disabled person belonging to a disabled people's community, you then go to your peers and you kind of talk about that and you reflect on it and process it, and you see the comedy in it. And I think that's what he was trying to say around the kind of the way it humanizes then the experience of the disabled person being part of their community, or disabled people watching films that are in one way problematic, but in another way allow you that way of having those conversations about the way we are positioned, the way that we are engaged with by non-disabled people.
Yeah.
And of course, I would say that you could argue, that the industry could watch this and go, well, you're being completely unfair because we treat everybody like this. Our stories of working class people, they're inspirational. Our stories of women, they're about inspirational, or they're horrific, or they're whatever. This is what we do to people. And in a way, they'd be fair to say that you're being unfair on the industry. We treat everybody this bad.
That actually raises another issue that I was thinking about with the documentary, actually, which is, and it rarely gets touched upon, even in a lot of academic work, is nobody, even though we can look at we must look at the intersections of this, and we must look at the intersections of that. Nobody ever does the class thing, hardly ever. And when you're looking at a film which was briefly there in that documentary, Rear Window, you're talking about a very rich man, and similarly with Me Before You, and when that white disabled, usually wheelchair user, it is at the centre. It usually is a very rich one as well. We get absolutely, so it always manages to completely separate whatever issue you're looking at, impairment and sexuality, away from any considerations of how on earth you make any of this stuff happen. Which I find hugely problematic.
Well, which again, the industry would step back and said, well, they're the only people we represent in any group.
Well, yeah, there is a truth in that. Yeah.
Miro, what were you going to say?
We should ignore it. Doesn't mean we should ignore it.
Oh no, absolutely. But I was just thinking about what you could say back to it, and you'd go, "Well, that's true. You treat us all like that, and you do only depict rich people. It's never live people in council houses. They've always got penthouse apartments on Fifth Avenue, that kind of shit." Miro.
No, I was going to say, in addition to Alison pointing out, and of course the opposite of that, for those, and again, I think if at all, it was only briefly mentioned in the documentary. The idea of those who are working class, or those of lower socioeconomic value viewed by the ruling elite, their answer is keep them where they are or place them in institutions. And when you have that idea of institutions in these kind of films were portrayed as these are desirable places to go, so like in Fences, when they send the brother or the nephew to the institution, and that's where he stays. And of course, it's the idea of, if you've got the wealth and you've got and your class is of a high class, then you can pay to have those adaptations, and you can have that space that you can live in and live your life. But of course, if you're of a lower socioeconomic value, the answer to you and to all the concerns that you have is institutionalization. But of course, and it's portrayed in a desirable way.
Yeah, and I think shit, I forgot what I was going to say. But I think the institutions. Again, because I worked for a few years for an organisation that is the largest institutionaliser of disabled people in Britain. Most people in those institutions loved it and were very glad to be there. And it's about thinking, why is that? Because outside is shit and scary. And you have to worry about money.
Absolutely.
And so actually, there's this idea, institutions, and I'm against institutions, I'm against institutionalization, but actually I can see and understand from my own personal experience and the life and the work I've done that actually I can quite understand why to a lot of disabled or some disabled people, they'd think, man, this beats living in the fucking real world.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
I had the same experience when I worked to promote independent living for people who'd been deinstitutionalised, and they were a lot of them were very frightened and felt very uprooted. So I think I completely agree.
you know, and I think it's those kind of nuances that you can't just make kind of generalized statements. You know, you can in 101, which is what we've agreed
Yeah,
basically this is, and I get that. But I think there were whole little things like that. And equally this idea of the positive and the negative. Actually, if your life as a disabled person in experiencing the real world is by and large negative, to see a positive representation, which tends to be a normalized, affluent one, there's nothing positive about that if
no,
that's not your life, you know. And so there's so many things at play there that you just think, you know, you need to be careful. I think we've discussed in previous ones, you know, saying about when you're talking about the water one, I forgot what it was called, Spirit of the Water. What was the one with Sally Hawkins? You know, so talking about how, you know, it should have been played by a disabled person, but she is a disabled person. And, you know, there's all these things at play there that you can't, it's becoming too complex that you need a kind of whole different narrative. You need to be able to extend it and push it beyond and understand the diversity of disabled people. Like you said at the very beginning, this is of the view that every disabled person thinks like this, and it's not true. And it's understandable that they don't. And actually, to say that they're wrong would be insulting to them as well. But again, I will recommend this to people, but I think this is an awful thing to say, but we know far too much for it to be good, and I'm glad that's true. But I'd still recommend it to people. Anybody else want to say anything before we finish? That moment of silence leads us to the end. Thank you, Miro. Thank you, Alison, and see you next time.